Hey comrades, so I'm going to be starting Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. So this will be the English translation that's translated by Constance Farrington. So right now I'm going to read the preface, which is by Jean-Paul Sartre. And like always, in the description will be a PDF if you want to follow along. Alright, so just in advance, I'm just reading what's written there. Okay. Not so very long ago, the Earth numbered 2,000 million inhabitants, 500 million men, and 1,500 million natives. The former had the word, the other had the use of it. Between the two, there were hired knightlets, overlords, and bourgeoisie, sham from beginning to end, which served as go-betweens. In the colonies, the truth stood naked, but the citizens of the mother country preferred it with clothes on. The native had to love them, something in the way the mothers are loved. The European elite undertook the manufacture, a native elite. They picked out promising adolescents. They branded them as with a red-hot iron with the principles of Western culture. They stuffed their mouths full with high-sounding phrases, grand, glutinous words that stuck to their teeth. After a short stay in the mother country, they were sent home whitewashed. These walking lies had nothing left to say to their brothers. They only echoed. From Paris, from London, from Amsterdam, we would utter the words Parthenon, brotherhood, and somewhere in Africa or Asia lips would open, ... Then on Thotherhood. It was the golden age. It came to an end. The mouths opened by themselves. The yellow and black voices still spoke of our humanism, but only to reproach us with our inhumanity. We listened without displeasure to the polite statements of resentment, at first with the proudest amazement. What? They are able to talk by themselves? Just look at what we have made them. We did not doubt that they would accept our ideals, since they accused us of not being faithful to them. Then, indeed, Europe could still believe in her mission. She had Hellenized the Asians. She had created a new breed, the Greco-Latin Negroes. We might add, quite between ourselves, as men of the world, quote, after all, let them bawl their heads off. It relieves their feelings. Dogs that bark don't bite, end quote. A new generation came on the scene, which changed the issue. With unbelievable patience, its writers and poets tried to explain to us that our values and the true facts of their lives did not hang together, and that they could neither reject them completely nor assimilate them. By and large, what they were saying was, quote, you are making us into monstrosities. Your humanism claims we are at one with the rest of humanity, but your racist methods set us apart, end quote. Very much at our ease, we listen to them all. Colonial administrators are not paid to read Hegel, and for that matter, they do not read much of him. But they do not need a philosopher to tell them that uneasy consciences are caught up on their own contradictions. They will not get anywhere. So, let us perpetuate their discomfort. Nothing will come of it but talk. If they were, the expert told us, asking for anything at all precise on their whaling, it would be integration. Of course, there is no question of granting that the system which depends on overexploitation, as you know, would be ruined. But it's enough to hold the carrot in front of their noses. They'll gallop all right. As to revolt, we need not worry at all. What native in his senses would go off to massacre their fair sons in Europe simply to become a European as they are? In short, we encourage these disconsolate spirits and thought it not to be a bad idea for once to award the Prix Goncourt to a Negro. That was before 1939. 1961. Listen. Quote, let us waste no time in sterile litanies and nauseating mimicry. Leave this Europe where they are, never done talking of man, yet murder men everywhere they find them, at the corner of every one of their own streets, in all the corners of the globe. For centuries they have stifled almost the whole of humanity in the name of a so-called spiritual experience." End quote. The tone is new. Who dares to speak thus? It is an African, a man from the third world, an ex-quote-unquote native. He adds, quote, "Europe now lives at such a mad, reckless pace that she is running headlong into the abyss. We would now do well to keep away from it." End quote. In other words, she's done for. A truth which is not pleasant to state, but of which we are all convinced, are we not, fellow Europeans, in the marrow of our bones? We must, however, make one reservation. When a Frenchman, for example, says to the other Frenchman, quote, "The country is done for," end quote, which has happened, I should think almost every day since 1930, it is emotional talk. Burning with love and fury, the speaker includes himself with his fellow countrymen, and then usually he adds, "unless." His meaning is clear. No more mistakes must be made. If his instructions are not carried out to the letter, then and only then will the country go to pieces. In short, it is a threat followed by a piece of advice, and these remarks are so much the less shocking in that they spring from a national intersubjectivity. But on the contrary, when Fanon says of Europe that she is rushing to her doom, far from sounding the alarm, he is merely setting out a diagnosis. This doctor neither claims that she is a hopeless case, miracles have been known to exist, nor does he give her a means to cure herself. He certifies that she is dying, on external evidence founded on symptoms that he can observe. As to curing her, no. He has other things to think about. He does not give a damn whether she lives or dies. Because of this, his book is scandalous. And if you murmur, jokingly embarrassed, "He has it in for us," the true nature of the scandal escapes you. For Fanon has nothing in for you at all. His work, red hot for some, in what concerns you, is as cold as ice. He speaks of you often, never to you. The black Goncourt and the yellow nobles are finished. The days of the colonized Laurier are over. An ex-native French-speaking bends that language to new requirements, makes use of it, and speaks to the colonized only. Quote, "Natives of all underdeveloped countries unite." End quote. What a downfall! For the fathers, we alone were the only speakers. The sons no longer even considered us as valid intermediaries. We are only the objects of their speeches, of course. Fanon mentions in passing our well-known crimes, Sétif, Hanoi, Madagascar, but he does not waste his time in condemning them. He uses them. If he demonstrates the tactics of colonialism, the complex play of relations which unite and oppose the colonists to the people of the mother country, it is for his brothers, his aims to teach them to beat us at our own game. In short, the third world finds itself and speaks to itself through his voice. We know that it is not a homogeneous world. We know, too, that enslaved peoples are still to be found there, together with some who have achieved a simulacrum of phony independence, others who are still fighting to attain sovereignty, and others, again, who have obtained complete freedom but who live under the constant menace of imperialist aggression. These differences are born of colonial history, in other words, of oppression. Here, the mother country is satisfied to keep some feudal rulers in her pay. There, dividing and ruling, she has created a native bourgeoisie, sham from beginning to end. Elsewhere, she has played a double game. The colony is planted with settlers and exploited at the same time. Thus Europe has multiplied divisions and opposing groups, has fashioned classes and sometimes even radical prejudices, and has endeavored by every means to bring about and intensify the stratification of colonized societies. Fanon hides nothing. In order to fight against us, the former colony must fight against itself. Or rather, the two struggles form part of a whole. In the heat of battle, all internal barriers break down. The puppet bourgeoisie of businessmen and shopkeepers, the urban proletariat which is always privileged position, the lumpen proletariat of the shanty towns all fall into line with the stand made by the rural masses. That veritable reservoir of national revolutionary army, for in those countries where colonialism has deliberately held up development, the peasantry, when it rises, quickly stands out as the revolutionary class. For it knows naked oppression, and suffers far more from it than the workers in the towns, and in order not to die of hunger, it demands no less than a complete demolishing of all existing structures. In order to triumph, the national revolution must be socialist. If its career is cut short, if the native bourgeoisie takes over power, the new state, in spite of its formal sovereignty, remains in the hands of the imperialists. The example of Katanga illustrates this quite well. Thus, the unity of the Third World is not yet achieved. It is a work in progress, which begins by the union, in each country after independence, as before, of the whole of the colonized people under the command of the peasant class. This is what Fanon explains to his brothers in Africa, Asia, and Latin America. We must achieve revolutionary socialism altogether everywhere, or else one by one we will be defeated by our former masters. He hides nothing, neither weakness nor discords nor mystification. Here the movement gets off to a bad start. There, after striking initial success, it loses momentum. Elsewhere, it has become to a standstill, and if it is to start again, the peasants must throw their bourgeoisie overboard. The reader is sternly put to his guard against the most dangerous will of the wisps, the cult of the leader and of personalities, Western culture, and what is equally to be feared, the withdrawal into the twilight of past African culture. For the only true culture is that of the revolution. That is to say, it is constantly in the making. Fanon speaks out loud. We Europeans can hear him, as the fact that you hold this book in your hands proves. Is he not then afraid that the colonial powers may take advantage of his sincerity? No, he fears nothing. Our methods are out of date. They can sometimes delay emancipation, but not stop it. And do not think that we can change our ways. Neo-colonialism, that idle dream of mother countries, is a lot of hot air. The quote-unquote third forces don't exist, or if they do, they are only the tin pot bourgeoisies that colonialism has already placed in our saddle. Our Machiavellianism has put little purchase on this wide-awake world that has run our falsehoods to earth one after another. The settler has only recourse of one thing, brute force, when he can command it. The native only has one choice, between servitude or supremacy. What does Fanon care whether you read his work or not? It is to his brothers that he denounces our old tricks, and he is sure we have no more up our sleeves. It is to them he says, quote, Europe has laid her hands on our continents, and we wish slash at her fingers till she lets go. It is a good moment. Nothing can happen at Bertia, at Elizabethville, or at the Algerian Bled, that the whole world does not hear about it. The rival blocks take opposite sides and hold each other in check. Let us take advantage of this paralysis. Let us burst into history, forcing it by our invasion into universality for the first time. Let us start fighting. And if we've no other arms, the waiting knife's enough. End quote. Europeans, you must open this book and enter into it. After a few steps into the darkness, you will see strangers gathered around a fire. Come close and listen, for they are talking of the destiny they will mete out to your trading centers and to the hired soldiers who defend them. They will see you, perhaps, but they will go on talking amongst themselves, without even lowering their voices. This indifference strikes home. Their fathers, shadowy creatures, your creatures, were but dead souls. You, it was allowed to them glimpses of light. To you, only did they dare speak. And you did not bother to reply to such zombies. Their sons ignore you. A fire warms them and shed light around them, and you have not lit it. Now, at a respectful distance, it is you who will feel furtive, night-bound, and perished with cold. Turn and turn about in these shadows from whence a new dawn will break. It is you who are the zombies. In this case, you will say, let us throw away this book. Why read it, if it is not written for us? 2 reasons. The first is that Fanon explains to you, his brothers, and shows them the mechanisms by which we are estranged from ourselves. Take advantage of this, and get to know yourselves seen in the light of truth, objectively. Our victims know us by their scars and by their chains, and it is this that makes their evidence irrefutable. It is enough that they show us what we have made of them for us to realize what they have made of ourselves. But is it any use? Yes, for Europe is at death's door. But you will say, we live in a mother country, and we disapprove of her excess. It is true, you are not settlers, but you are no better. For the pioneers belong to you. You sent them overseas, and it was you they enriched. You warned them that if they shed too much blood you would disown them, or say you did, in something of the same way as any state maintains abroad a mob of agitators, agents, provocateurs, spies, whom it disowns, when they are caught. You, who are so liberal and so humane, who have such an exaggerated adoration of culture that it verges on affection, you pretend to forget that your own colonies and that in them men are massacred in your name. Fanon reveals to his comrades above, all to some of them who are rather too westernized, the solidarity of people of the mother country and of their representatives in the colonies. Have the courage to read this book, for in the first place it will make you ashamed, and shame, as Marx said, is a revolutionary sentiment. You too, I too, am incapable of ridding myself of subjective illusions. I too say to you, quote, all is lost, unless, ellipses, end quote. As a European, I steal the enemy's book, and out of it I fashion as a remedy for Europe. Make the most of it. And here's the second reason. If you set aside Sorel's fascist utterances, you will find that Fanon is the first since Engels to bring the process of history into the clear light of day. Moreover, you need not think that the hot-headedness or unhappy childhood has given him some uncommon taste for violence. He acts as an interpreter of the situation. That's all. But this is enough to enable him to constitute step by step the dialectic which liberal hypocrisy hides from you, and which is as much responsible for our existence as his. During the last century, the middle classes looked on their workers as covetous creatures, made lawless by their greedy desires. But they took care to include these great brutes in our own species, or at least they considered that they were free men, that is to say, free to sell their labor. In France, as in England, humanism claimed to be universal. In the case of forced labor, it is quite the contrary. There is no contrast, moreover, there must be intimidation, and thus oppression grows. Our soldiers overseas, rejecting the universalism of the mother country, apply the quote-unquote numerous clauses to the human race. Since none may enslave, rob, or kill his fellow man without committing a crime, they lay down the principle that the native is not one of our fellow men. Our striking power has been given the mission of changing this abstract certainty into reality. The order is given to reduce the inhabitants of the annexed country to the level of superior monkeys in order to justify the settlers' treatment of them as beasts of burden. Violence in the colonies does not only have for its aim the keeping of these enslaved men at arm's length, it seeks to dehumanize them. Everything will be done to wipe out their traditions, to substitute our language for theirs, to destroy their culture without giving them ours. Sheer physical fatigue will stupefy them. Starved and ill, if they have any spirit left, fear will finish the job. Guns are leveled at the peasant. Civilians come to take over his land and force him, by dint of flogging, to till the land for them. If he shows fight, the soldiers fire, and he is a dead man. If he gives in, he degrades himself, and he is no longer a man at all. Shame and fear will split up his character and make his utmost self fall to pieces. The business is conducted with flying colors and by experts. The quote-unquote psychological services weren't established yesterday, nor was brainwashing. And yet, in spite of all these efforts, their ends are nowhere achieved. Neither in the Congo, where Negroes' hands were cut off, nor in Angola, where until very recently malcontents' lips were pierced in order to shut them with padlocks. I do not say that it is impossible to change a man into an animal. I simply say that you won't get there without weakening him considerably. Blows will never suffice. You have to push the starvation further, and that's the trouble with slavery. For when you domesticate a member of our own species, you reduce his output, and however little you may give him, a farmyard man finishes by costing more than he brings in. For this reason, the settlers are obliged to stop the breaking in halfway. The result, neither man nor animal is the native. Beaten, undernourished, ill, terrified, but only up to a certain point. He has, whether he's black, yellow, or white, always the same traits of character. He's a sly boost, a lazy bones, and a thief, who lives on nothing and who understands only violence. Poor settler, here is his contradiction, naked shorn of its trappings. He ought to kill those he plunders, as they say dissensions do. Now, this is not possible, because he must exploit them as well. He can't carry massacre on to genocide and slavery to animal-like degradation. He loses control, the machine goes into reverse, and relentless logic leads him on to decolonization. But it does not happen immediately. At first the European's reign continues. He has already lost the battle, but this is not obvious. He does not yet know that the natives are only half native. To hear him talk, it would seem that he ill-treats them in order to destroy or repress the evil that they have rooted in them. After 3 generations, their pernicious instincts will reappear no more. What instincts does he mean? The instincts that urge slaves on to massacre their master? Can he not here recognize his own cruelty turned against himself? In the savagery, these oppressed peasants, does he not find his own settler savagery, which they have absorbed through every pore and for which there is no cure? The reason is simple. This impetuous being, crazed by his absolute power and by the fear of losing it, no longer remembers clearly that he was once a man. He takes himself for a horsewhip or a gun. He has come to believe that the domestication of the quote-unquote inferior races will come about by the conditioning of their reflexes. But in this he leaves out the account, the human memory, and the ineffectible marks left upon it. And then, above all, there is something which perhaps he has never known. We only become what we are by the radical and deep-seated refusal of that which others have made us. 3 generations, did we say? Hardly has the 2nd generation opened their eyes, then from then on they've seen their fathers being flogged. In psychiatric terms, they are quote-unquote traumatized for the rest of their life. But these constantly renewed aggressions, far from bringing them to submission, thrust them into an unbearable contradiction, which the European will pay for sooner or later. After that, when it is their turn to be broken in, when they are taught what shame and hunger and pain are, that is stirred up in them is a volcanic fury whose force is equal to that of the pressure put upon them. You say they understand nothing but violence? Of course. First, the only violence is the settlers, but soon they will make it their own. That is to say, the same violence is thrown back upon us as when our reflection comes forward to meet us when we go towards a mirror. Make no mistake about it. By this mad fury, by this bitterness and spleen, by their ever-present desire to kill us, by the permanent tensing of powerful muscles which are afraid to relax, they have become men. Men because of the settler who wants to make beasts of the burden of them. Because of him and against him, hatred, blind hatred, which is yet an abstraction, is their only wealth. The master calls it forth because he seeks to reduce them to animals, but he fails to break it down because his interests stop him halfway. Thus, the quote-unquote half-natives are still humans through the power and the weakness of the oppressor, which is transformed within them to a stubborn refusal of the animal condition. We realize what follows. They're lazy, of course. It's a form of sabotage. They're sly and thieving. Just imagine! But their petty thefts mark the beginning of a resistance which is still unorganized. That is not enough. There are those among them who assert themselves by throwing themselves bare-handed against the guns. These are their heroes. Others make men of themselves by murdering Europeans, and these are shot down. Brigands or martyrs, their agony exalts the terrified masses. Yes, terrified. At this fresh stage, colonial aggression turns inward in a current terror among the natives. By this, I do not only mean the fear that they experience when faced with our inexhaustible means of repression, but also which their own fury produces in them. They are cornered between our guns pointed at them and those terrifying compulsions, those desires for murder which spring from the depth of their spirits and which they do not always recognize, for at first it is not their violence, it is ours, which turns back on itself and rends them, and the first action of these oppressed creatures is to bury deep down that hidden anger which their and our moralities condemn, and which is however only the last refuge of their humanity. Read Fanon. You will learn how. In the period of their helplessness, their mad impulse to murder is the expression of the natives' collective unconscious. If this suppressed fury fails to find an outlet, it turns in a vacuum and devastates the oppressed creatures themselves. In order to free themselves, they even massacre each other. The different tribes fight in between themselves since they cannot face the real enemy, and you can count on the colonial policy to keep up their rivalries. The man who raises his knife against his brother thinks that he has destroyed once and for all the detested image of their common degradation, even though these expiatory victims don't quench their thirst for blood. They can only stop themselves from marching against the machine guns by doing our work for us. Of their own accord, they will speed up the dehumanization that they reject. Under the amused eye of the settler, they will take the greatest precautions against their own kind by setting up supernatural barriers, at the times reviving old and terrible myths, at others binding themselves by scrupulous rites. It is in this way that an obsessed person flees from his deepest needs, by blinding himself to certain observances which require his attention at every turn. They dance. That keeps them busy. It relaxes their painfully contracted muscles, and then the dance mimes secretly, often without their knowing, the refusal they cannot utter and the murders that they do not dare commit. In certain districts they make use of that last resort, possession by spirits. Formerly this was a religious experience in all its simplicity, a certain communication of the faithful with sacred things. Now they make it a weapon against the humiliation and despair. Mumbo-jumbo, and all the idols of the tribe come down among them, rule over their violence and waste it in trances until this is exhausted. At the same time, these high-placed personages protect them. In other words, the colonized people protect themselves against colonial estrangement by going one better in religious estrangement. with the unique result that finally they add the two estrangements together and each reinforces the other. Thus, in certain psychosis, the hallucinated person, tired of always being insulted by his demon, one fine day starts hearing the voice of an angel who pays him compliments, but the jeers don't stop for all that. Only from then on they alternate with congratulations. This is a defense, but is also the end of the story. The self is dissociated and the patient heads for madness. Let us add, for a certain other carefully selected unfortunates, that the other witchery of which I have already spoken, Western culture. If I were them, you may say, I'd prefer my mumbo-jumbo to their Acropolis. Very good, you've grasped the situation. But not altogether, because you aren't them. Or not yet. Otherwise, you would know that they can't choose. They must have both. 2 worlds. That makes 2 bewitchings. They dance all night, and at dawn they crowd into the churches to hear Mass. Each day the split widens. Our enemy betrays his brothers and becomes our accomplice. His brothers do the same thing. The status of quote-unquote native is a nerving condition introduced and maintained by the settler among colonized people with their consent, laying claim to and denying the human condition at the same time. The contradiction is explosive. For that matter, it does explode. You know as well as I do, and we are living at the moment when the match is put to the fuse, when the rising birth rates wider famine in its wake, when these newcomers have life to fear rather more than death. The torrent of violence sweeps away all barriers. In Algeria and Angola, Europeans are massacred at sight. It is the moment of the boomerang. It is the 3rd phase of violence. It comes back on us, it strikes us, and we do not realize any more than we did the other times that it's we who have launched it. The quote-unquote liberals are stupefied. They admit that we were not polite enough to the natives, that it would have been wiser and fairer to allow them certain rights insofar as this was possible. They ask nothing better than to admit them into batches and without sponsors to that was very exclusive club, our species. And now this barbarous, mad outburst doesn't spare them any more than the bad settlers. The left at home is embarrassed. They know the true situation of the natives, the merciless oppression they are submitted to. They do not condemn their revolt, knowing full well that we have done everything to provoke it. But all the same, they think to themselves, there are limits. These guerrillas should be bent on showing that they are chivalrous, that some be the best way of showing they are men. Sometimes the left scolds them. Quote, you are going too far, we won't support you anymore. End quote. The natives don't give a damn about their support. For all the good it does them, they might as well stuff it up their backsides. Once their war begun, they saw this hard truth, that every single one of us has made his bit, has got something out of them. They don't need to call anyone to witness. They'll grant favored treatment to no one. There is one duty to be done, one end to achieve, to thrust out colonialism by every means in their power. The more far-seeing among us will be, in the last resort, ready to admit this duty and this end, but we cannot help seeing in this ordeal by force the altogether inhumane means that the less than men make use of to win the concession of the charter of humanity. Accord it to them at once, then, and let them endeavor by peaceful undertakings to deserve it. Our worthiest souls contain radical prejudice. They would do well to read Fanon, for he shows clearly that this irrepressible violence is neither sound and fury, nor the resurrection of savage instincts, nor even the effect of resentment. It is a man recreating himself. I think we have understood this truth at one time, but we have forgotten that no longer gentleness can efface the marks of violence. Only violence itself can destroy them. The native cures himself of colonial neurosis by thrusting out the settler through force of arms. When his rage boils over, he rediscovers his lost innocence, and he comes to know himself that he himself creates himself. Far removed from his war, we consider it as a triumph of barbarism, but of its own violence it achieves slowly but surely the emancipation of the rebel. For bit by bit it destroys him, and around him the colonial gloom. Once begun, it is a war that gives no quarter. You may fear or be feared, that is to say, abandon yourself to the dissociations of a sham existence or conquer your birthright of unity. When the peasant takes his gun in his hands, the old myths grow dim, and the prohibitions are one by one forgotten. The rebel's weapon is the proof of his humanity. For in the first days of the revolt you must kill. To shoot down a European is to kill two birds with one stone. To destroy an oppressor and the man he oppresses at the same time, there remain a dead man. And a free man, the survivor, for the first time feels a national soil under his foot. At this moment, the nation does not shrink from him. Wherever he goes, wherever he may be, she is. She follows, and is never lost to view, for she is one with his liberty. But, after the first surprise, the colonial army strikes, and then all must unite or be slaughtered. Tribal dissensions weaken and tend to disappear. In the first place, because they endanger the revolution, but for the more profound reason that they serve no other purpose than to divert violence against false foes. When they remain, as in the Congo, it's because they are kept up by the agents of colonialism. The nation marches forward. For each of her children, she is to be found wherever his brothers are fighting. Their feeling for each other is the reverse of the hatred they feel for you. They are brothers inasmuch as each of them has killed and may at any moment have to kill again. Fanon shows his readers the limits of quote-unquote spontaneity and the need for and the dangers of organization. But however great may be the task at each turning of the way of the revolutionary consciousness deepens. The last complexes flee away. No one needs to come to us talking of the quote-unquote dependency complex of an ALN soldier. With his blinkers off, the peasant takes account of his real needs. Before they were enough to kill him, but he tried to ignore them. Now he sees them as infinitely great requirements. In this violence which springs from the people, which enables them to hold out for 5 years, for 8 years, as the Algerians have done, the military, political, and social necessities cannot be separated. The war, by merely setting the question of command and responsibility, institutes new structures which will become the first institutions of peace. Here, then, is man, even now established in new traditions, the future children of a horrible present. Here, then, we see him legitimized by a law which will be born, or is born each day under fire. Once the last settler is killed, shipped home, or assimilated, the minority breed disappears to be replaced by socialism. And that's not enough. The rebel does not stop there, for you can be quite sure that he is not done risking his skin to find himself at the level of a former inhabitant of the old mother country. Look how patient he is. Perhaps he dreams of another Dien Bien Phu but does not think he's really counting on it. He's a beggar fighting in his poverty against rich men powerfully armed, while he is waiting for decisive victories or even without expecting them at all. He tires out his adversaries until they are sick of him. It will not be without fearful losses the colonial army becomes ferocious. The country is marked out. There are mopping up operations, transfers of the population, reprisal expeditions, and they massacre women and children. He knows this. This new man begins his life as a man at the end of it. He considers himself as a potential corpse. He will be killed. Not only does he accept this risk, He's sure of it. This potential dead man has lost his wife and his children. He has seen so many dying men that he prefers victory to survival. Others, not he, will have the fruits of his victory. He too is weary of it all. But this weariness of the heart is the root of an unbelievable courage. We find our humanity on this side of death and despair. He finds it beyond torture and death. We have sown the wind. He is the whirlwind, the child of violence. At every moment he draws from it his humanity. We were men at his expense. He makes himself man at ours, a different man, of higher quality. Here Fanon stops. He has shown the way forward. He is the spokesman of those who are fighting, and he has called for a union, that is to say, the unity of the African continent against all dissensions and all particularisms. He has gained his end. If he wished to describe in all its detail the historical phenomenon of decolonization, he would have to have spoken of us. This is not at all his intention. But when we have closed the book, the argument continues within us, in spite of its author, for we feel the strength of the peoples in revolt, and we answer by force. Thus there is a fresh moment of violence, and this time we ourselves are involved, for by its nature this violence is changing us, according to the quote-unquote half-native is changed. Every one of us must think for himself, always provided that he thinks at all. For in Europe today, stunned as she is by the blow received by France, Belgium, or England, even to allow your mind to be diverted, however slightly, is as good as being the accomplice in the crime of colonization. This book had not the slightest need of a preface, all the less because it is not addressed to us. Yet I have written one in order to bring the argument to its conclusion. We in Europe, too, are being decolonized. That is to say, that the settler which is in every one of us being savagely rooted out, let us look at ourselves, if we can bear to, and see what is becoming of us. First we must face that unexpected revelation, the striptease of our humanism. There you can see it, quite naked. And it's not a pretty sight. It was nothing but an ideology of lies, a perfect justification for pillage. Its honeyed words, its affection of sensibility, were only alibis for our aggressions. A fine sight they are, too, the believers in non-violence, saying that they are neither executioners nor victims. Very well, then. If you're not victims when the government which you've voted for, when the army in which your younger brothers are serving without hesitation or remorse have undertaken race murder, you are, without a shadow of a doubt, executioners. And if you choose to be victims, and to risk being put in prison for a day or two, you are simply choosing to pull your irons out of the fire. But you will not be able to pull them out. They'll have to stay there till the end. Try to understand at any rate. If violence began this very evening, and if exploitation and oppression has never existed on the earth, perhaps the slogans of non-violence might end the quarrel. But if the whole regime, even your non-violent ideas, are conditioned by a thousand-year-old oppression, your passivity serves only to place you in the ranks of the oppressors. You know well enough that we are exploiters. You know, too, that we have laid hands on first the gold and metals, then the petroleum of the quote-unquote new continents, and that we have brought them back to the old countries. This was not without excellent results, as witness our palaces, our cathedrals, and our great industrial cities. And then when there was the threat of a slump, the colonial markets were there to soften the blow or to divert it. Crammed with riches, Europe accorded the human status du jour to its inhabitants. With us, to be a man is to be an accomplice of colonialism, since all of us, without exception, have profited by colonial exploitation. This fat, pale continent ends by falling into what Fanon rightly calls narcissism. Cocteau became irritated with Paris, quote, "that city which talks about itself the whole time," end quote. Is Europe any different? And that super-European monstrosity, North America? Chatter, chatter, liberty, equality, fraternity, love, honor, patriotism, and what have you. All this did not prevent us from making anti-racial speeches about dirty N-words, dirty Jews, and dirty Arabs. High-minded people, liberal or soft-hearted, protest that they were shocked by such inconsistency, but they were either mistaken or dishonest. For with us there is nothing more consistent than a racist humanism, since the European has only been able to become a man through creating slaves and monsters. While there was a native population somewhere, this impostor was not shown up. In the notion of the human race, we found an abstract assumption of the universality which served as a cover for the most realistic practices. On the other side of the ocean, there was a race of less than humans who, thanks to us, might reach our status 1,000 years hence. Perhaps, in short, we mistook the elite for the genus. Today, the native populations reveal their true nature, and at the same time, our exclusive quote-unquote club reveals its weakness, that it's neither more nor less a minority. Worse than that, since the others become men in name against us, it seems that we are the enemies of mankind. The elite shows itself in its true colors. It is nothing more than a gang. Our precious sets of values begin to molt. On closer scrutiny, you won't see that isn't stained with blood. If you are looking for an example, remember these fine words. How generous France is. Us? Generous? What about Sétif then? And those 8 years of ferocious war that cost the lives of over 1 million Algerians? And the tortures? But let it be understood that nobody reproaches us with being false to such and such a mission, for the very good reason that we had no mission at all. It is generosity itself that is in question. This fine melodious word has only one meaning, the granting of statutory charter. For the folk across the water, new men, freedmen, no one else has the power nor the right to give anything to anyone, for each of them has every right and the right to everything. And when one day our humankind becomes full-grown, it will not define itself as the sum of the whole world's inhabitants, but as the infinite unity of their mutual needs. Here I stop you. You will have no trouble finishing the job. All you have to do is look at our aristocratic virtues straight in the face for the first and last time. They are cracking up. How could they survive the aristocracy of underlings who brought them into being? A few years ago, a bourgeois colonist commentator found only this to say in defense of the West. Quote unquote, we aren't angels, but we, at last, feel some remorse. Quote, end quotes. What a confession! Formerly our continent was buoyed up by other means, the Parthenon, Chartres, the right of man, or the swastika. Now we know what these are worth, and the only chance of our being saved from the shipwreck is the very Christian sentiment of guilt. You can see it's the end. Europe is springing leaks everywhere. What has happened? It simply is that in the past we made history, and now it is being made of us. The ratio of forces is being inverted. Decolonization has begun. All that our hired soldiers can do is delay its completion. The old quote-unquote mother countries have still to go the whole hog. They still have to engage their entire forces in a battle which is lost before it has begun. At the end of the adventure, we again find that colonial brutality which was beguiled doubtful glory, but though it has been multiplied tenfold, it's still not enough. The national service units are sent to Algeria, and they remain there 7 years with no result. Violence has changed its direction. When we were victorious, we practiced it without it seeming to alter us. It broke down the others, but for us men, our humanism remained intact. United by their prophets, peoples of the mother countries baptized their commonwealth of crimes, calling them fraternity and love, today violence blocked everywhere comes back on us through soldiers, comes inside and takes possession of us. Involution starts. The native recreates himself, and we settlers and Europeans, ultras and liberals, we break up. Rage and fear are already blatant. They show themselves openly in the N-word hunts in Algiers. Now, which side are the savages on? Where is barbarism? Nothing is missing. Not even the totems or the motor horns beat out Algérie Français when Europeans burn mausoleums alive. Fanon reminds us, not so very long ago, a congress of psychiatrists was distressed by the criminal propensities of the native population. Quote, "Those people kill each other," end quote, they said. Quote, "That isn't normal. The Algerian's cortex must be underdeveloped," end quote. In Central Africa, others have established that, quote, "the African makes very little use of his frontal lobes," end quote. These learned men would do well today to follow up their investigations in Europe, and particularly with regard to the French. For we too, during the last few years, must be the victims of quote-unquote frontal sluggishness, since our patriots do quite a bit of assassinating of their fellow countrymen, and if they're not at home, they blow up their house and their concierge. This is only a beginning. Civil war is a forecast for the autumn or for the spring of next year, yet our lobes seem to be in perfect condition. Is it not rather the case that since we cannot crush the natives, violence comes back on its tracks, accumulates in the very depth of our nature, and seeks out a way out? The union of the Algerian people causes the disunion of the French people. Throughout the whole territory of the ex-mother country, the tribes are dancing their war dances. The terror has left Africa and is settling here, for quite obviously there are certain furious beings who want to make us pay with our own blood for the shame of having been beaten by the native. Then, too, there are others, all the others who are equally guilty, for after Britza, after the lynchings of September, who among them came out into the streets to shout, "We've had enough?" ? But less spectacular, the liberals and the toughs of the tender left. The fever is mounting amongst them too, and resentment at the same time. And they certainly have the wind up. They hide their range in myths and complicated rites in order to stave off the day of reckoning and the need for decision they have put at the head of our affairs. A grand magician whose business it is to keep us all in the dark at all costs. Nothing is being done. Violence, proclaimed by some, disowned by others, turns in a vacuum. One day it bursts out at Metz, the next at Bordeaux. It's here, there, and everywhere. Like in a game of Hunt the Slipper, it's our turn to thread the path step by step which leads down to native level, but becomes natives altogether. Our soil must be occupied by a formerly colonized people, and we must starve of hunger. This won't happen, for it's a discredited colonialism which is taking hold of us. This is the sentile, arrogant master who will straddle us. Here he comes, our mumbo-jumbo. And when you have read Fanon's last chapter, you will be convinced that it would be better for you to be a native at the uttermost depths of his misery than to be a former settler. It is not right for a police official to be obliged to torture for 10 hours a day. At that rate, his nerves will fall to bits, unless the torturers are forbidden in their own interest to work overtime. When it is desirable that the morality of the nation and the army should be protected by their rigors of the law, it is not right that the former system should systematically demoralize the latter, nor that country with a republican tradition should confide hundreds and thousands of young folk to the care of just officers. It is not right, my fellow countrymen. You know very well all the crimes committed in our name, it's not at all right that you do not breathe a word about them to anyone, not even to your own soul, for fearing that having to stand in judgment of yourself. I am willing to believe that at the beginning you did not realize what was happening. Later, you doubted whether such a thing could be true. But now you know, and still you hold your tongues. 8 years of silence. What degradation! And your silence is all to no avail. Today, the blinding sun of torture is at its zenith. It lights up the whole country. Under that merciless glare, there is not a laugh that does not ring false, not a face that is not painted to hide fear or anger, not a single affliction that does not betray our disgust and our complacency. It is enough today for 2 French people to meet together, for there to be a dead man between them. 1 dead man, did I say? In other days, France was the name of a country. We should take care that in 1961 it does not become the name of a nervous disease. Will we recover? Yes. For violence, like the Achilles' lance, can heal the wounds that it has afflicted. Today we are bound hand and foot, humiliated and sick with fear. We cannot fall lower. Happily, this is not yet enough for the colonialist aristocracy. It cannot complete its delaying mission in Algeria until it has first finished colonizing the French. Every day we retreat in front of the battle, but you may be sure that we will not avoid it. The killers need it. They'll go for us and hit out blindly to left and right. Thus the day of magicians and fetishes will end you. You will have to fight, or rot in concentration camps. This is the end of the dialectic. You condemn this war, but do not yet dare to declare yourselves to be on the side of the Algerian fighters. Never fear, you can count on the settlers and the hired soldiers. They'll make you take the plunge. Then, perhaps, when your back is to the wall, you will let loose, at last, that new violence which is raised up in you by old, oft-repeated crimes. But as they say, that's another story. The history of mankind. The time is drawing near, I am sure, when we will join the ranks of those who made it. Jean-Paul Sartre. All right, so that was the preface, and later on in the same playlist there will be chapter 1, which is called Concerning Violence.